They had been warned to anticipate brutality. A young Japanese nurse, barely 20 years of age, occupied a wooden seat within a makeshift infirmary. Her uniform was tattered, a crimson stain spreading across one sleeve. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of antiseptic and damp canvas. Across from her, an American medic meticulously tended to her wounded arm, unfurling a pristine white dressing with deliberate precision. His movements were sure, his voice low, as though he were caring for his own kin. Though she couldn't decipher his words, the sentiment was clear. It was not animosity, nor a sense of victory, but an unexpected gentleness. Around them, other women were presented with steaming bowls of stew, consuming in a single sitting more than they had in days. Some received freshly laundered and folded uniforms, while others had their injuries disinfected. This was not a haven, not yet. It was bewilderment. For years she had been instructed that capture was a fate worse than death. Bushido, the ancient warrior's creed, had permeated the spirit of every soldier and auxiliary, descending from the samurai's valor. To capitulate was to bring shame upon one's lineage, one's ancestors, one's emperor. The disgrace was meant to be insufferable. She had even recited the vow herself during her training. Better to perish than be taken. Every woman present had internalized this. They believed surrender would result in degradation, starvation, or torments so agonizing that death would appear as a blessed release. This was the narrative their superiors had propagated. This was the expectation of their families. Yet, within this tent, amidst the aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread, that narrative began to unravel. The chasm between expectation and the unfolding reality was almost overwhelming. When the Americans first advanced, she had braced for the impact of a rifle butt, for derisive laughter, for the victorious glare of conquerors. Instead, one had extended a cigarette, another had offered a canteen of water. As the medic touched her arm to examine the injury, she flinched as if struck, but he merely offered a sympathetic frown, a nod, and continued his work. She found herself captivated by the pristine bandage against her bruised skin, questioning if it was some elaborate deception. The conflict she had endured offered no space for such moments. In the Pacific Theater, she had witnessed soldiers abandoned by their own units, left to bleed out because their weakened bodies could no longer sustain the march. She had seen meager rations of rice divided into infinitesimal portions, sometimes supplemented with bark or sawdust. She had observed officers strike their subordinates for faltering under extreme exhaustion. This, they were told, was discipline. This was honor. Suffering was the measure of devotion. Compassion was seen as a weakness. That was the world she had understood until this juncture. The statistics paint a part of this grim tableau. Between 35,000 and 50,000 Japanese servicemen, alongside a still substantial number of women, were taken prisoner before the war concluded in August of 1945. They had all been fed the identical narrative. The enemy would strip them of their dignity, subjecting them to indignities so vile that self-termination would be preferable. However, what they frequently encountered was precisely the opposite. American detention facilities, governed by the principles of the Geneva Convention, were established not on cruelty but on systematic protocols, predicated on the understanding that a living, well-cared-for captive held greater value than one subjected to abuse. For the Americans, a healthy detainee was a reservoir of intelligence, a tool for propaganda, and a demonstration of moral superiority. For the Japanese, the very notion of such humane treatment was inconceivable. Yet, numerical data and treaty stipulations cannot encapsulate the emotional impact on a 20-year-old nurse receiving a bowl of soup instead of scorn. She had not tasted meat for weeks. The broth was rich, coating her lips with a savory film, fragrant with vegetables whose names she had long forgotten. As she swallowed, her entire body trembled, not solely from hunger, but from a profound sense of disbelief. Beside her, an older woman, dabbing her mouth with a cloth, wept openly. To weep over a simple stew might seem preposterous, even comical. Nevertheless, in that moment, the food transcended its basic sustenance. It was tangible proof that their captors perceived them as human beings. The irony was profound. While Japanese propaganda relentlessly asserted that American confinement meant utter degradation, here were guards who learned their names, physicians who tended their wounds, and cooks who dispensed bread as if nourishing comrades. Concurrently, Allied prisoners languishing in Japanese camps faced starvation rations, confinement in bamboo cages, and backbreaking labor. 1 in every 3 would succumb. The disparity was astonishing, almost grotesque. One side incorporated survival into its detainment strategy, the other engineered death. Nevertheless, confidence was not readily bestowed. Some women initially rejected sustenance, convinced it was poisoned. Others secreted away the chocolate they received, certain it was a lure. The nurse herself hesitated when the medic extended a cup of coffee, its steam spiraling upwards like an offering. She had never sampled it before. Upon finally drinking, the sharp bitterness startled her palate. She coughed, and the medic emitted a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if amused by her unfamiliarity. That simple human sound, the laughter of an adversary, breached her defenses more profoundly than any projectile. The shock was not merely physical, but cultural. These women had been raised within a societal framework that systematically eroded their individuality. They were auxiliaries, cogs in the vast war machine. Their comfort was deemed inconsequential. Their suffering was a testament to their allegiance. Yet here, in the custody of their supposed enemies, they were treated as individuals. A bed signified the importance of one body. A blanket represented that warmth was not a sign of weakness. A bandage implied that healing was a worthwhile endeavor. These elementary provisions, so commonplace to the Americans, struck the women who received them like profound revelations. It was a world turned on its head. Soldiers prepared for death discovered themselves being nourished. Nurses ready for disgrace found themselves treated with respect. Even the quietude of the camp at night was disorienting. No shrill commands, no ritualistic punishments. Only the distant murmur of guards conversing softly amongst themselves, the faint strains of a harmonica carried across the barracks. Some women remained awake, gazing at the ceiling, questioning if they had entered a realm of captivity or a surreal dream. Fear was present undeniably, but so too were the nascent sparks of something far more potent: curiosity. If the Americans were not monsters, then what else had been fabricated? If capture did not equate to dishonor, then what precisely constituted honor? These inquiries began to propagate silently through the group, exchanged in hushed tones in the darkness, scribbled in letters home when permitted. For the nurse, the pivotal moment arrived when she was handed not merely food, not simply bandages, but a pencil and a sheet of paper. She was informed that she could pen a message to her family. She gazed at the blank page for an extended period. She had been told such a correspondence was impossible, that the enemy would never permit the free flow of words. Yet, here it was, the vacant paper awaiting inscription. She wrote, "Mother, I am alive. They provide me with sustenance. They treat me with kindness. I no longer comprehend this war." That very letter, like countless others, would be intercepted by Japanese intelligence. Its contents would undoubtedly trouble those who perused it. How could a haven exist within a prison? How could dignity flourish behind barbed wire? She did not realize it then, but this was merely the genesis. The dressing on her arm was more than just fabric. It was a thread that began to unravel an entire belief system, one that would ultimately confront her and her nation with questions far more agonizing than any physical wound. The initial morning within the camp felt akin to stepping into an entirely different dimension. The women awoke not to boisterous commands or the sharp cadence of marching boots, but to the subtle aroma of bacon wafting through the barracks. The air was crisp, the light filtered softly through the wooden slats of the walls, and for a brief interval they lay still, half persuaded it was a sensory illusion. Then came the summons for breakfast, not bellowed in anger, but spoken with a steady, measured tone. They shuffled uncertainly into formation, their steps hesitant, as if anticipating the imminent collapse of the charade. Instead, they were presented with trays laden with eggs, bread, and steaming mugs of coffee. Some women stood transfixed. One murmured that it must be a trial. But as they observed the American guards partaking in the same fare without any reservation, their suspicions began to dissipate. The young nurse lifted her fork with fingers that trembled. She had known a hunger so acute it gnawed at her very bones. Now, with the initial bite, her body jolted into awareness, the richness of the yolk on her tongue, the yielding softness of the bread against her teeth. These sensations were almost jarring in their novelty. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. Around her, others consumed the food with a quiet desperation, their innate dignity wrestling with their gnawing hunger. One woman suddenly emitted a laugh, tinged with hysteria, and then quickly covered her mouth in mortification. Yet, no guard reprimanded her. No punishment ensued. The guards merely cast glances of mild curiosity, as if laughter, even in this context, was permissible. The sleeping quarters themselves were a revelation. Sturdy wooden frames, thin mattresses, and actual blankets. After months of slumbering on bare earth or woven mats, the act of reclining on something soft felt almost improper, as though comfort itself were a betrayal. The nurse sat on the edge of her cot, clutching the blanket as if it might vanish. For the first time since departing her home, she possessed an item that was solely hers. That blanket became a symbol not merely of warmth, but of inherent worth. The camp was far from opulent. Barbed wire still demarcated its perimeter. Guards maintained their vigil with firearms. Yet, the atmosphere thrummed with a peculiar paradox. Confinement interwoven with benevolence. In the afternoons, the women were offered work assignments, voluntary in nature, not compulsory. Some opted to assist in the kitchens, learning the American method of baking bread with yeast instead of rice flour. Others undertook the task of sweeping the grounds or tending to the gardens. One day, the nurse was handed a small packet of seeds. When she inquired about their purpose, the guard gestured towards an empty patch of soil and uttered words she didn't fully grasp, but the intent was abundantly clear. Cultivate something. To a woman trained to mend wounds and administer sedatives, the prospect of nurturing life from the earth felt alien. Yet her fingers tingled, not with apprehension, but with a strange sense of anticipation. Correspondence was another source of astonishment. The internees were informed they could communicate with their families. Skepticism was immediate. Surely these missives would never reach Japan. But upon receiving paper and pencils, the women sat in contemplative silence, their gazes fixed on the blank sheets. Gradually, words began to flow onto the page. One wrote of the meals, another of the warmth of her sleeping arrangement, a third of the dressings applied by American physicians. Their voices, once subdued by the weight of Bushido, now found expression through ink. Those letters would later undergo scrutiny, ultimately reaching the hands of Japanese officials, who found themselves reading accounts that directly contradicted their own official narratives. In the evenings, time was allocated for leisure activities. The guards provided reading materials, some in English, others translated into rudimentary Japanese. Musical instruments were also available, harmonicas, and in one camp, even a piano. One evening, the nurse sat outdoors as a fellow internee played a hesitant melody, its notes drifting across the compound. She closed her eyes, hearing not martial anthems or victory songs, but something tender, almost childlike. It was music pursued for its inherent beauty alone. In her previous world, aesthetic appeal was consistently viewed with suspicion, a distraction from one's duties. Here, it was permitted. The irony was so potent, it was almost palpable. While these women adjusted to 3 meals daily, their families back in Japan subsisted on rations so meager that children resorted to gnawing on bark to quell their hunger. Allied assessments indicated that the average Japanese civilian consumed fewer than 200 calories per day in 1944. Meanwhile, within the American compounds, internees gained weight, their faces filling out, their bodies regaining strength. The paradox was starkly cruel. Captivity offered a more abundant life than freedom had. Initially, many of the women recoiled from these comforts, clinging to the conviction that accepting them was tantamount to dishonor. Some consumed their meals with rigid posture, refusing to display any sign of appreciation. Others discreetly concealed food in their pockets, convinced that the benevolence would abruptly cease. However, with the passage of time, the imperative of survival gradually eroded ideological rigidity. A stomach filled with eggs possessed a more compelling, persuasive power than a pamphlet of slogans. The nurse herself found that each night as she drew the blanket around her shoulders, the internal voice whispering, "Shame," grew fainter. In its stead, another whisper emerged, "Perhaps I am worthy of this." Yet, the dissonance remained. How could adversaries treat them more favorably than their own officers had? How could strangers exhibit concern for wounds that their comrades had overlooked? One woman, who had previously been assaulted by her superior for succumbing to fever, gazed at her arm where an American doctor had administered medication. She remained silent, but her unspoken query resonated louder than any words. Moments of unexpected mirth also occurred. The initial introduction to peanut butter precipitated widespread bewilderment. One woman cautiously dipped a finger into the brown paste, sniffed it, then tentatively licked it. Her expression contorted as if betrayed, and she promptly spat it out, eliciting laughter from the guards. Another woman attempted it, then another, until eventually even the nurse found herself smiling, amused by the peculiar, sticky sweetness. In that shared laughter lay a fissure in the edifice of fear. The Americans, far from being tormentors, appeared almost like amused companions in this peculiar experiment of captivity. Nevertheless, beneath the surface of warmth lay a more profound undercurrent. Each act of kindness eroded the very foundations of what these women understood about honor and warfare. If surrender did not signify disgrace, then what had they been sacrificing their lives for? If the enemy was capable of exhibiting gentleness, then who, in reality, was the true barbarian? These questions lingered in every serving of soup, every meticulously applied bandage, every musical note that drifted through the night air. The nurse, once steadfast in the belief that her life belonged solely to the emperor, now lay awake on her narrow mattress, tracing the imperfections in the wooden ceiling. She contemplated her mother, frail and hungry in a home devoid of warmth, and her brothers marching in worn uniforms. She recalled the hearty stew, the spontaneous laughter, the promise of seeds awaiting cultivation. She felt as though she stood precariously balanced between two disparate worlds, one disintegrating, the other shrouded in uncertainty. What unsettled her most was not the comfort itself, but the profound implication it carried, that her life, her individual existence, possessed intrinsic value. That realization was more fundamentally destabilizing than any weapon, because once one has tasted dignity, it can never be forgotten. And as the week progressed, as letters traversed oceans, as whispers of this improbable sanctuary reached the ears of those still engaged in combat, the ramifications would inevitably extend far beyond the confines of the camp's fencing. The days spent in captivity began to settle into a predictable rhythm, steady and almost disarming. Morning roll call, followed by breakfast consisting of either eggs or porridge, then hours that unfolded with possibilities none of the women had ever anticipated. The barbed wire remained a stark silhouette against the horizon, yet, within its bounds, a more subtle transformation was unfolding. It was not merely about survival, it was the gradual, quiet revolution of reclaiming one's dignity. The young nurse found herself in a classroom one afternoon, a small piece of chalk clutched in her hand. Before her, the blackboard displayed English letters meticulously inscribed by a volunteer guard who also served as an instructor. She hesitated, her fingers stiff, before attempting to trace her own shaky rendition of the word home. The guard offered an encouraging nod, a simple gesture that carried a weight she couldn't articulate. She had never been prompted to learn for her own personal enrichment. Education in her former life had been solely about service, about honing oneself into an effective instrument. Here, the opportunity to learn was presented as if her existence held significance beyond her utility. That humble word on the blackboard opened a doorway to a realm she had never imagined existed. Letters penned from the camp became another form of classroom. When she wrote to her mother, her initial attempts were strained, her words stiff and awkward. What could she possibly confess? That she was well fed while her family endured starvation. That American doctors examined her wounds with a care that her own commanding officers had never demonstrated. She settled on simple, unvarnished truths. The food was warm, the sleeping quarters were clean, and the guards were remarkably kind. She couldn't fathom their motives, but she wanted her mother to know she was alive. Weeks later, when she heard rumors that such letters were routinely intercepted and read by Japanese officials, she mused over what those men in Tokyo might have pondered as they handled her correspondence. Did they recognize the emerging cracks in the narrative they had so meticulously constructed? Medical care emerged as another unexpected arena of transformed perception. One woman, who had suffered from a persistent toothache for years, was escorted to the camp dentist. The chair was cold, metallic, and the overhead lamp cast a harsh glare. But when the American leaned over and spoke softly, she realized with a sudden jolt that his intention was to alleviate her discomfort. Moments later, the offending tooth was removed, and for the first time in years, she experienced a profound sense of relief. She touched her jaw in disbelief. No officer in her own military would have offered such respite from her suffering. The act was not merely medical, it was revolutionary. Pain, she began to understand, was not an inescapable destiny. It could be met with compassion. Even faith found a place within the camp's boundaries. A few of the women quietly assembled a small shrine using stones and fragments of wood, arranging it discreetly in a secluded corner. They anticipated it might be dismantled. However, when an American guard observed it, he merely offered a nod and continued on his patrol. This tacit permission was startling. To practice one's devotion without fear of scrutiny felt akin to drawing a breath after being submerged for an extended period. Others participated in informal gatherings where a Christian chaplain offered words of solace, not through coercion, but with a peculiar, unforced gentleness that left them feeling unsettled. The very concept of choice was foreign. The empire had demanded unwavering adherence. The Americans, however, allowed for individual expression. Music, too, began to permeate their lives like clandestine joy. On quiet nights, the melancholic strains of a harmonica would drift across the compound, played either by a guard or sometimes by a prisoner who had learned from him. The notes were often rudimentary, but they carried an undeniable warmth. The nurse would sit on her bunk, her eyes closed, envisioning a world beyond the ravages of war. Music had previously been associated with solemn ceremonies or strict directives. Here, it existed solely for its aesthetic value, a quiet reminder that life encompassed more than the commands shouted through loudspeakers. With each passing day, the contrast intensified. Allied prisoners interned in Japanese camps were being worked to the point of exhaustion in mines and jungles, their bodies emaciated, their spirits crushed. Reports indicated that 1 in every 3 would perish before their eventual liberation. Yet, within these American facilities, the Japanese women's cheeks grew fuller, their strength returned, and their laughter began to re-emerge. The dissonance was almost unbearable. They had been indoctrinated with the belief that Americans were demonic entities. However, demons do not provide sewing kits, books, or blankets to ward off the cold. Each act of kindness represented a blow against the formidable wall of their ingrained fear, and that wall was beginning to crumble. The transformation was not a dramatic upheaval. It was subtle. It manifested in exchanged glances, in quiet confidences, in the subtle shift in the way the women began to carry themselves. The nurse noticed that she no longer instinctively hunched with shame when guards passed. Instead, she met their gazes cautiously, acknowledging a shared humanity across the divide. Another woman, who had once concealed her food, began to eat openly, no longer fearing it would be confiscated. These were minor alterations, almost imperceptible, yet collectively they constituted something monumental. Nevertheless, the specter of shame persisted. Some women whispered late at night that they could never face their families, that their surrender was unforgivable regardless of the treatment they received. One even contemplated ending her life within the camp, so profound was the burden of dishonor. Yet, it was another prisoner who intervened, gripping her hands tightly and imploring, "If the enemy values our lives, then why do we not?" That question hung in the air, impossible to dismiss. It was the seed of transformation, the discovery of self-worth through the eyes of those they had been taught to despise. The Americans, perhaps unwittingly, wielded kindness as a weapon far more potent than any firearm. Intelligence flowed more readily from lips unbroken by torture, offered freely by individuals who felt a sense of obligation. But something even more profound was at play. These women were not merely complying. They were awakening to the radical notion that dignity was not contingent upon obedience or the acceptance of death. It was an intrinsic right, an entitlement that no emperor or general could possibly nullify. One evening, as gentle raindrops tapped against the tin roof of the military quarters, the nurse held a pair of newly fitted spectacles in her hands, intended for her own use. She put them on, and the world around her snapped into sharp focus. Previously indistinct lines now stood out clearly. Edges became precise, and faces, which had been a blurry indistinctness for years, were now plainly visible. She blinked back a surge of emotion that threatened to spill from her eyes. The American physician who had presented her with the glasses offered a simple remark. No one ought to exist in a state of perpetual blur. She comprehended enough to grasp the deeper significance of his words. It wasn't merely about physical sight, but about a newfound mental clarity. For the very first time, she not only perceived the external world with newfound sharpness, but also saw herself with a similar lucidity. These profound shifts, however, were not achieved without a considerable price. They strained allegiances and destabilized deeply held convictions. What was the true meaning of serving an empire that deliberately starved its own people while simultaneously providing sustenance to its adversaries? How could one uphold a code that mandated self-destruction when life itself was offering such an unexpected reprieve and unexpected kindness? Each woman grappled with these agonizing questions in isolation, yet collectively, their internal struggles formed a silent, unspoken symphony of doubt and uncertainty. The nurse frequently retreated to her humble blanket at night, her fingers tightly gripping its edge, recalling the solemn vow she had once taken. The principle was simple. It was preferable to perish than to yield. Now she lay alive, enveloped in warmth and sustenance, grappling with the profound question of whether she had betrayed her homeland, or if it was her homeland that had ultimately abandoned her. This gnawing uncertainty evolved into the most significant wound, far more debilitating than any shrapnel injury and infinitely more challenging to mend. Beyond the confines of the camp, whispers began to circulate across the vast expanses of the battlefields. Tales emerged of prisoners being treated with unexpected kindness, of women permitted to pen letters to loved ones, of dignity being upheld even within the confines of barbed wire enclosures. Soldiers who had previously marched resolutely into seemingly hopeless engagements now found themselves faltering, if only for a fleeting moment, their minds questioning whether capture might indeed represent an unexpected deliverance rather than an absolute end. Such hesitation was inherently perilous, posing a threat not only to the imperial armies, but to the very essence of the empire's foundational beliefs. The nurse was yet unaware of the full magnitude of the unfolding events. All she knew for certain was that when she happened to glance into a mirror one evening, borrowed from the infirmary, she saw far more than just a prisoner staring back at her. She recognized a human being, a person of inherent worth, irreplaceable and vibrantly alive. And once this profound realization had firmly taken root, there was no turning back. What remained beyond her current comprehension was how this subtle, unheralded transformation would resonate far beyond the confines of the fences, fundamentally reshaping not only her own existence, but also the trajectory of an entire nation still clinging fiercely to its deeply ingrained myths. The war concluded not with the deafening roar of artillery, but with an encompassing silence. When the official declaration finally arrived, the women within the camps did not erupt in cheers. Instead, they sat in a state of stunned disbelief, their gazes fixed upon the ground, unsure if they could truly believe the news. Japan had formally surrendered. The very empire that had demanded their demise rather than their capture had at last yielded. The barbed wire still served as a visual delimiter to their surroundings, but its symbolic meaning had irrevocably altered. It no longer designated them as captives in an ongoing conflict. It now marked them as silent witnesses to its conclusion. The process of repatriation commenced at a deliberate, unhurried pace. Trains, ships, and convoys were meticulously organized to facilitate their return to a homeland they had not seen for many years. The young nurse boarded a vessel bound for Yokohama, her hand tightly clutching a small collection of personal effects that the Americans had graciously permitted her to retain: a blanket, her spectacles, and the letter she had penned to her mother. The ocean stretched out before them, an immense expanse of gray, and she couldn't help but wonder what awaited her. Would she be welcomed as a survivor who had endured, or would she be ostracized as a traitor? Would the unexpected kindness she had experienced during her captivity simply dissipate the moment her feet touched Japanese soil? The Japan to which she returned was utterly transformed, almost unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, families were on the brink of starvation, and children bore the hollow-eyed gauntness of profound hunger. Her home had vanished, and her mother appeared thinner than her heart could bear to witness. Food was critically scarce, and fuel even more so. The populace spoke in hushed tones of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of incandescent firestorms and the ultimate surrender. Yet, Amidst this widespread devastation, the nurse carried within her the vivid recollections of unexpected plenty: hot, nourishing meals, crisp, clean linens, and dedicated doctors who showed genuine concern. To articulate these experiences felt perilous, almost sacrilegious. Nevertheless, she found herself incapable of erasing them from her mind. The stark contrast served as a constant, unsettling reminder. How was it possible that captivity could offer a greater measure of humanity than freedom? Other women shared strikingly similar narratives. They spoke in hushed tones in secluded corners, recounting accounts of American guards who remembered their names, of individuals who displayed unexpected acts of musicality, and of the initial moments when they were treated as sentient individuals rather than mere instruments of the state. Some candidly admitted to having acquired proficiency in the English language. Others confessed to having immersed themselves in the pages of American literature. For a select few, these transformative experiences served as potent catalysts for profound personal change. They found themselves compelled to re-examine everything they had been indoctrinated with: the intrinsic value of self-sacrifice, the true meaning of honor, and the predetermined role of women solely in service to the empire. The quiet revolution that had been initiated behind the barbed wire did not cease upon their release. It followed them home. Not everyone possessed the fortitude to bear its weight. Some were met by families who regarded them with suspicion, deeply ashamed that they had surrendered at all. A handful of women never spoke of their time in captivity again, attempting to bury the memories as if mere silence could effectively erase them. Yet, others bravely carried their personal testimonies into the nascent, fragile landscape of the new Japan, sharing with their neighbors that the Americans had not been monstrous figures, but rather human beings, flawed yet imbued with compassion. Their words served to unsettle those who had constructed their identities upon a foundation of fear and animosity towards the enemy. For the occupying forces, these newfound voices became invaluable, unexpected conduits, tangible evidence that peaceful coexistence was not merely a theoretical possibility, but an achievable reality. Intelligence officials later acknowledged that the humane treatment afforded to prisoners had yielded benefits far exceeding their initial expectations. Cooperation emerged organically from individuals who felt genuinely respected. Military secrets were divulged not out of coercion, but from a peculiar sense of obligation, even profound gratitude. Some historians proposed that this deliberate policy might have significantly shortened the duration of the war, potentially saving countless lives. However, for the women themselves, the most enduring legacy was not strategic in nature. It was deeply personal. They had been granted a glimpse into a world where inherent dignity was not something to be arduously earned through suffering, but was freely bestowed. One afternoon, several months after her return, the nurse sat with her mother amidst the remnants of their once familiar home. They painstakingly boiled weeds to create a thin, bitter broth. Her mother, her voice soft and her gaze averted, inquired about the camp. The nurse paused for a moment, then began to describe the meals, the comfortable beds, and the letters. She recounted the experience of an American doctor placing spectacles upon her nose, and the profound moment when she saw the world with unparalleled clarity for the first time in years. Her mother wept quietly, not from shame or regret, but from an overwhelming sense of relief. "At least," she whispered, "someone remembered that you were a human being." The irony was almost unbearable. The empire had promised unparalleled glory and delivered only abject starvation. The enemy, who had promised absolutely nothing, had instead offered unexpected kindness. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been inverted. The women who had navigated this profound paradox would never again perceive warfare in the same light. Some dedicated themselves to becoming outspoken advocates for peace, their voices, though seemingly small, carrying an insistent message within a society grappling with the immense task of rebuilding. Others carried their memories internally, allowing them to subtly shape the way they nurtured their children, instilling in them the belief that compassion could ultimately triumph over cruelty. Even decades later, when historians conducted interviews with former female prisoners, their words still resonated with the same profound astonishment. One woman recalled, "They gave me chocolate, and I couldn't believe it was real. I was convinced it was a trick, but then I observed the guard consuming the same piece. That singular moment fundamentally altered me. If the enemy was capable of sharing chocolate, What other unexpected gifts might the world hold? Another shared, "I learned English during my time in the camp. I still speak it fluently. Sometimes I even dream in English." These testimonies, fragile yet possessing immense power, collectively formed a rich tapestry of experiences that defied the simplistic narratives propagated by propaganda. The quiet revolution of dignity did not lead to the overthrow of governments, but it undeniably transformed individual lives. It demonstrated that even amidst the most brutal of conflicts, acts of kindness could effectively erode the most hardened ideologies. The nurse, who had once fervently believed her sole value lay in unwavering service to the emperor, now understood a far different truth. She had been recognized and valued by complete strangers. She had been treated as though her suffering mattered, as though her hunger warranted relief, and as though her very vision deserved to be restored to clarity. This newfound knowledge was indelible, an immutable truth that could never be rescinded. It is possible that the Americans did not intentionally set out to instigate such profound transformations. Their policies were largely pragmatic, rooted in their obligations under the Geneva Conventions and informed by strategic considerations. However, the unintended consequence was revelation. Humane treatment possessed the power to achieve victories that no bomb ever could. The Empire's command had dictated death over dishonor. The Americans, in contrast, had demonstrated that life preserved with dignity held a far greater, more potent influence. The nurse carried these profound truths within her quietly, yet they illuminated every facet of her existence. As she walked through the devastated streets, as she observed occupation soldiers distributing provisions to hungry children, and as she held her mother's hand in the quiet of the night, she remembered the camp not as a place of confinement, but as a strange, paradoxical sanctuary. It was not a paradise of material luxury, but a sanctuary of rediscovered humanity, a place where she found her inherent worth in the most unexpected of circumstances. And so, the narrative of these women does not conclude at the edge of the barbed wire. It continues to linger in the hushed silence of their memories, in the subtle yet significant changes they brought about within their families, and in the enduring testimonies they left behind. It persists in the simple objects they carried home, the spectacles, the letters, the blankets, which transformed into potent symbols of a truth far grander than the war itself. For in the ultimate reckoning, the most astonishing revelation was not that the Americans had treated them with kindness. It was the profound realization that kindness itself could endure in a world consumed by destruction, that dignity could flourish even in captivity, and that even adversaries could serve as powerful reminders of one's own humanity. And, as the hushed accounts of these experiences began to disseminate, first through intimate family circles, then spreading to entire villages, and eventually crossing vast oceans, they carried with them a question that profoundly unsettled both the victors and the vanquished alike. If a semblance of paradise could indeed exist within the confines of a prison, what did that revelation imply about the world at large?